Most people walking the Brooklyn waterfront today have no idea that one of the city's most important labor martyrs once fought and died here, a young longshoreman whose name barely survived the decades even though his courage shook the docks to their core. And that name was Pete Panto, a man who stood up at a time when the waterfront wasn't just controlled by union bosses, but by the mobsters behind them, a time when challenging the wrong people didn't just cost you your job, it could cost you your life. Pete Panto wasn't a famous politician, he wasn't a celebrity, and he wasn't the kind of figure anyone expected to change history. He was simply a smart, principled longshoreman in his mid-20s who saw the corruption around him and refused to stay quiet about it, and that refusal made him one of the most dangerous men on the Brooklyn docks. To the mob, anyway. In the 1930s, the Brooklyn waterfront was a world unto itself, a shadow city built on crates, cargo holds, picket lines, and tired men hoping for just one day of work. Jobs weren't handed out fairly. They were controlled through a system known as the shape-up, where workers lined up in front of hiring bosses and waited to be chosen, sometimes bribing union officials or mob-connected foremen just for the chance to haul cargo for a few dollars. And behind those foremen stood powerful crime figures tied to Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared mobsters in New York, a man whose influence touched nearly every pier on the East River and the Brooklyn shore. The official leader of the union, the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, was Joseph Ryan, a man long criticized for letting organized crime shape the daily realities of dock workers. And under him, corruption had become so common that most longshoremen didn't even call it corruption anymore. It was simply how the docks worked. You paid, you kept quiet, and you hoped to be chosen when the hiring boss pointed his finger. But Pete Panto didn't believe that's how a union was supposed to function. And he definitely didn't believe that mobsters should be deciding who got work and who didn't. So in 1939, he did something almost nobody on the docks dared to do. He called out the corruption in the open, loudly, publicly, and in front of the very workers the leadership depended on. Panto began organizing reform meetings across Brooklyn, especially in Red Hook and the Columbia Street waterfront district, gathering longshoremen after their shifts or on Sundays in church basements and rented halls. These meetings grew quickly because the workers were desperate for change, and Panto had a rare combination of clarity and courage. He spoke plainly about kickbacks, about favoritism, about hiring bosses who acted like dictators, and about the workers who were suffering because of it. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he offered something none of the leadership was offering: honesty, and a plan to push the ILA toward democratic reforms. It didn't take long for his movement to catch the attention of people who didn't like being challenged, and in the summer of 1939, the name Pete Panto began to circulate through the circles of union officials and mob-aligned figures who kept the docks in line. These were the same circles that had historically used intimidation and violence to maintain control, and Panto's sudden rise threatened a system that had kept a lot of powerful men very comfortable. On July 14, 1939, Pete Panto received a phone call at his home in Brooklyn. According to accounts from the time, he told his family he had business to discuss with union people and that he'd be back soon. He walked out the door, and that was the last time anyone saw him alive. No dramatic chase, no witnesses describing a struggle, no sensational clues. He simply left home and vanished. When he didn't return, worry spread quickly through the waterfront community. Workers whispered to each other that something bad had happened, but nobody could say it directly because saying the wrong thing could bring the wrong kind of attention. Still, Panto's supporters refused to let his disappearance fade. Across Brooklyn, longshoremen began writing "Dove Panto," Italian for "Where is Panto?" on walls, docks, and even subway stations. It became a quiet act of defiance in a world where most acts of defiance were punished. But the truth was that the men who controlled the docks, the men Panto criticized, had far more power and far more muscle than the reform movement, and without a body, there was nothing the police could do. The case stalled, rumors spread, and the Brooklyn waterfront slipped back into its old routines. Except now, there was an empty space where Pete Panto's voice used to be. For more than a year, his fate remained a mystery. Supporters continued to speak his name, journalists occasionally referenced his disappearance, and reformers kept pressure on the ILA. but there were no answers until January 24th, 1941, when a gruesome discovery was made on a farm in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. Workers digging near an old lime pit uncovered a burlap sack containing human remains, badly decomposed, the victim bound and dumped like trash. Dental records later confirmed what everyone feared. The body was Pete Panto. That lime pit in Lyndhurst was known to investigators as a dumping ground linked to Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of several New York crime families. And while nobody was ever formally convicted of Panto's murder, the consensus among historians, law enforcement, and labor researchers is clear. Panto was killed because his reform movement threatened the control that organized crime and corrupt union officials held over the docks. The case never led to charges because the witnesses who might have spoken were either too afraid, too loyal to the mob, or dead by the time authorities deepened their investigations. Like many mob-connected murders of the era, the crime became an open secret. Everyone knew who ordered it, but nobody could prove it in court. But Panto's story didn't vanish with him. His murder became a symbol of everything wrong with the Brooklyn waterfront. The brutality, the corruption, the chokehold the mob had on honest workers, and the failure of the system to protect someone who tried to clean it up. His death inspired outrage across the labor community and helped spark the early stages of waterfront reform, which would continue for decades and eventually lead to major investigations, public hearings, and a slow unraveling of mob control. Playwright Arthur Miller studied Panto's case while researching waterfront corruption, and although his script, The Hook, was never filmed due to political pressure, it became a powerful artistic representation of the forces Panto was fighting against. For years after his death, Pete Panto's grave went unmarked, a quiet patch of earth for a man who deserved far more. But his legacy continued to grow as labor historians dug deeper into the story, and modern reformers recognized the importance of preserving his memory. Eventually, efforts were made to properly mark his burial site and honor the sacrifice he made. Today, when people talk about the mob's grip on New York labor, the image that comes to mind is often the docks, fog rolling in off the water, ships creaking at their moorings, tired men lining up each morning hoping for work, all under the watch of bosses and enforcers who controlled everything from overtime to life expectancy. But hidden inside that world is the story of a young man who believed enough in justice to say no, and kept saying no until someone made sure he could never speak again. And that's what makes Pete Panto's story so powerful. He wasn't trying to become famous. He wasn't looking for a legacy. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He just wanted the men he worked alongside to have fairness, dignity, and a union that actually protected them. And for that simple belief, he was murdered, buried in a lime pit, and nearly erased from history. But New York has a way of keeping its ghosts close. And if you walk the Brooklyn waterfront long enough, if you listen to the wind rolling across the old piers, if you pay attention to the stories the city whispers when nobody is around, you can still hear his name, faint, defiant, unbroken. Where's Panto? He's right here, in the story of a city that tried to forget him, and in the workers who finally made sure it couldn't.